The cabin of United Airlines Flight 2247 is somewhere over the Nevada desert, 36,000 feet above the Earth's surface. When the woman in seat 14C decides that the silence of the man sitting beside her is a personal insult, the Boeing 737-800 carries 289 passengers on this Tuesday morning, bound nonstop from Los Angeles International to Chicago O'Hare, with an estimated flight time of 3 hours and 52 minutes. Outside the oval windows, the sky is a flawless, indifferent blue. Inside, the recycled air hums with the low-frequency engine drone that experienced flyers have long since learned to tune out. But in row 14, something is about to shatter that ordinary cabin peace so completely that every person on this aircraft will remember this flight for the rest of their lives. The woman is somewhere in her mid-40s. She is wearing a cream blazer with the shoulders cut, just slightly too wide, and her highlighted hair has been sprayed into a shape that will not move for the remainder of the morning. Her name, as the crew will come to learn it, is Sandra Whitmore. She boarded through the main cabin door 40 minutes ago carrying 2 oversized personal items and a disposition that the gate agent back in Los Angeles privately described to her colleague as a Category 4 weather event looking for somewhere to make landfall. The man in 14B has not spoken since he sat down. He has not spoken because he cannot speak. He is a slim man of approximately 60 years, with close-cut silver hair and the kind of posture that suggests either military service or a long relationship with chronic pain. He settled into the window seat before boarding was even halfway complete, arranged a small canvas tote bag beneath the seat in front of him with the practiced economy of a seasoned traveler, and pulled out a slim paperback novel with the quiet, self-contained ease of someone who has made peace with the world exactly as it is. Sandra Whitmore arrived in the middle seat approximately 8 minutes later. She exhaled loudly upon seeing him. She placed her larger carry-on in the overhead bin with a percussive determination that rattled the luggage already stored there. She sat down, spread her elbows onto both armrests simultaneously, and then turned to the man beside her and introduced herself in the way that certain people introduce themselves. Not as an invitation, but as a declaration. The man looked up from his book. He smiled. He reached into the front pocket of his shirt and produced a small laminated card, which he extended toward her. The card read, in clean printed text, "I am deaf-mute. I communicate through writing, sign language, or lip reading. Thank you for your patience." Sandra Whitmore stared at the card for a long moment. She handed it back without expression. And then she did something that the flight attendant in the forward galley, a 12-year United veteran named Maria Chun, would later describe to investigators as the moment she knew this flight was going to be a problem. Sandra leaned toward the man, and at a volume clearly intended for the surrounding rows, she said, "Well, isn't that just great? I'm going to be stuck next to a mute for 4 hours." The engine hum continued. The altitude stayed at 36,000 feet. But something in the cabin changed in that moment, subtle and immediate, like the drop in air pressure that precedes a storm you cannot yet see but can already feel in your bones. Stay with this story, because what happens next is something that not even the most experienced crew member on this aircraft could have anticipated. Sandra Whitmore was not born entitled. This is important to understand because the simplest villains are also the least interesting, and Sandra's particular brand of cruelty had a history behind it that, while it explained nothing, illuminated everything. She had grown up in Scottsdale, Arizona, the eldest daughter of a moderately successful real estate developer who taught her, through behavior more than words, that the world was organized into 2 categories of people, those who commanded and those who were commanded. Sandra had spent 47 years aggressively occupying the first category. She ran a mid-sized event planning company out of the west side of Los Angeles. She had 3 employees who lasted an average of 11 months before resigning or being terminated. She had filed complaints with 4 different airlines in the past 3 years, American, Delta, Southwest, and now United, for infractions that included, in no particular order, a flight attendant who failed to address her as ma'am, an overhead bin that was full when she arrived at her row, a gate change that she claimed she was not personally notified of despite the gate change being announced 6 times over the terminal public address system, and a seat that she described as vibrating, differently than the one I sat in last time. She had a United Mileage Plus Gold card, which she believed conveyed upon her a status that the physical dimensions of coach seating simply could not accommodate. She had been upgraded exactly once 2 years ago, due to an overbooking on a Phoenix to Las Vegas shuttle flight, and she had spent the intervening 24 months attempting to recreate those 40 minutes of first-class experience through a combination of demands, complaints, and what she privately called advocating for herself. This morning's flight to Chicago was, in Sandra's estimation, already going badly before it began. She had not been upgraded despite checking the app 14 times the evening before. The gate agent, a young man named Devin who had done nothing wrong, had confirmed, twice, politely, that the flight was full and there were no available upgrades. Sandra had made a comment about the state of airline customer service that Devin had absorbed with the practiced stillness of someone who has accepted that some days are simply like this. She had boarded in Group 3, which was, she felt, an indignity. She had placed her carry-on in the bin above row 12 despite sitting in row 14, because the bin above 14 was already occupied, a decision that would later require the flight attendant Maria to spend 4 minutes reorganizing luggage to accommodate a passenger who actually sat in row 12. And now she was sitting next to a man who, she had already decided, was going to be a problem. The man's name was Douglas Reeve. He was 61 years old. He had been profoundly deaf since the age of 19, following a bout of bacterial meningitis that had cost him his hearing over the course of a terrifying 10-day hospital stay during his sophomore year of college. He had adapted to that loss with a grace and thoroughness that his family, his friends, and his colleagues would describe, unprompted, as one of the most quietly remarkable things any of them had ever witnessed. Douglas had gone on to finish his degree in criminal justice. He had spent the next 32 years doing work that we will come back to, work that is, in fact, the entire pivot point of this story, but which we will set aside for now because at 36,000 feet over Nevada, none of that background is visible. What is visible is a man reading a novel about mountain climbers, occupying exactly his share of the armrest, asking nothing of anyone, doing absolutely nothing wrong. He was flying to Chicago to visit his daughter, who had just had her first child 3 weeks prior. He carried, in the canvas tote under the seat, a small wrapped gift, a soft white blanket with the baby's name embroidered on the edge, and a card that he had written by hand, in the slow and careful cursive of someone who communicates primarily through other means. He had booked this specific flight 6 weeks ago because his daughter had asked him to come for her daughter's first-month birthday celebration. He had arranged the time off from his current consulting work. He had taken the window seat because he prefers to watch the landscape when possible, finding in the shifting geometry of farmland and mountain range a kind of visual conversation that has, over 40 years of silence, never stopped being beautiful. None of this was visible to Sandra Whitmore. What was visible to Sandra Whitmore was an obstacle. And now you're about to see what happens when a woman who has spent 4 decades treating other people as obstacles runs headlong into a situation she cannot control, on an aircraft from which she cannot leave, surrounded by people who are watching every single move she makes. The first 15 minutes after takeoff had been, by the standards of what was to come, relatively calm. Sandra had ordered a tomato juice with exactly 2 ice cubes, not 3 from Maria, the forward flight attendant, and had received it, and had found it acceptable, which was as close to contentment as Sandra generally arrived at in public spaces. Douglas had been reading his book. The couple in 14A had been watching a downloaded film on a shared laptop. The business traveler in 14D, across the aisle, had fallen asleep before wheels up and had not yet stirred. The disruption began in the specific way that so many airplane disruptions begin, with an armrest. Sandra had been using both armrests since she sat down. Douglas had not contested this. He had the window and the view and his book, and seemed entirely unmoved by the territorial claim she had silently staked on the seat's shared geography. But at some point around 35 minutes into the flight, Douglas shifted his position slightly, the unconscious readjustment of someone settling deeper into a story, and his left elbow made brief contact with Sandra's right elbow on the center armrest. Sandra turned to look at him. Douglas did not notice because Douglas was reading and because Douglas cannot hear, and no one tapped him on the shoulder. Sandra put her magazine down. She put it down in the deliberate, theatrical way of someone who needs the act of putting down a magazine to register as an event. "Excuse me," she said, at a volume that was already slightly elevated above conversational. "Excuse me." Douglas continued reading. He was at a particularly good part. "Excuse me." The volume now reached the row in front and the row behind. A child in 13A turned around. The sleeping business traveler in 14D briefly stirred and then drifted off again. Douglas felt. He is attuned, as many deaf individuals are, to the peripheral physical signals of his environment. A presence turning toward him, a shift in the cabin's social atmosphere. He looked up from his book. He saw Sandra staring at him. He produced his laminated card again, with a patience that the watching passengers would later remark upon, almost unanimously, as extraordinary. Sandra looked at the card. She looked back at him. And then she did what she had done in Devon the gate agent's face that morning, what she had done to the flight attendant who failed to address her as ma'am, what she had done to the 11-month employee who had eventually submitted her resignation via a letter that ran to 3 pages. She decided that the facts of the situation were less important than her feelings about the situation, and she began to escalate. "I cannot believe," she announced, to no one and everyone simultaneously, "that they would seat someone like this next to a normal passenger. I'm trying to communicate with him and he won't even respond. This is a safety issue. This is an actual safety issue." Maria Chun appeared from the forward galley within approximately 45 seconds. She had excellent instincts and very good hearing. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Maria asked in the specific tone of someone who already knows the answer and is providing the other person an opportunity to reconsider. "Yes, there is a problem," Sandra said. "This man will not communicate with me. I've been trying to talk to him and he's completely ignoring me. How is that safe? What if there's an emergency?" Maria looked at Douglas. Douglas looked at Maria. He held up his laminated card again with the same patience. Maria read it, nodded, and turned back to Sandra. "The gentleman is deaf-mute, ma'am," Maria said. "He's communicated that to you with his card. He's in compliance with all FAA regulations and poses no safety concern whatsoever." "That is not the point," Sandra said. "The point is that I am uncomfortable. I am a Gold Mileage Plus member, and I am telling you that I am uncomfortable and I need to be moved." Maria took a breath. "I understand that you're uncomfortable, ma'am. Unfortunately, this flight is completely full. There are no open seats available in any cabin. What happened over the next 90 seconds will be described later, in the official incident report, in the following language. Passenger in seat 14C became verbally aggressive toward cabin crew and adjacent passenger, using language that several witnesses described as derogatory and discriminatory in nature. What actually happened is this. Sandra Whitmore, 47 years old, event planner from Los Angeles, Gold Mileage Plus member, twice in the past 30 seconds offered an off-ramp that she chose not to take, looked at the man beside her. A man who was sitting quietly reading a book, who had done nothing wrong, who had done nothing at all except exist in proximity to her, and said, loudly enough for rows 12 through 16 to hear clearly, "I have no idea why airlines allow people with disabilities to sit in regular seats. They should be in a separate section. This is not what I paid for. He's not going to be any use in an emergency. He can't even hear an announcement." The cabin went very, very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a settled flight. A different kind of quiet. The kind that has weight. Here is what you need to understand, and pay very careful attention to this next part. United Airlines Flight 2247, LAX to ORD, had not been chosen at random this Tuesday morning by the 83 people currently seated throughout the coach cabin who were neither on personal travel nor the flight crew. It had been chosen, specifically and deliberately, as the transport leg for what the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Chicago field office had organized as a cross-departmental travel day, coordinating with the Los Angeles field office, the Transportation Security Administration's national office, and the Department of Homeland Security's Air Travel Security Division. The reason for this coordination was a classified training exercise being conducted at O'Hare over the next 72 hours, involving tactical response scenarios in aviation environments. 83 of the passengers on this aircraft were either active FBI special agents, FBI trainee agents, TSA supervisors, DHS officials, or affiliated law enforcement personnel traveling to this exercise. They had, per standard procedure for law enforcement personnel traveling in plain clothes on commercial aviation, not identified themselves to the airline beyond the standard background clearance protocols. They were, in every visible respect, ordinary passengers. They were seated throughout the cabin, in window seats and middle seats and aisle seats, in the rows behind Douglas and in front of him, across the aisle, further back. Some were in their 30s, some in their 50s. Some had ordered coffee, some had declined the beverage service. Some were reading, some were on their phones, some had their eyes closed. All of them had heard Sandra Whitmore. Every single one. Douglas Reeve, the man she was targeting, had served for 32 years as a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, retiring 14 months ago at the mandatory age of 57 as the head of the Chicago Field Office's Counterintelligence Division. He was, in the most literal possible sense, the person that many of the agents currently seated in rows 8 through 28 had either trained under, worked alongside, or spent years hoping to emulate. But we are not there yet. We are still in the moment after Sandra's declaration, in the quality of silence that has descended over the center section of a Boeing 737 to 800 at 36,000 feet. And Maria Chan is standing in the aisle with an expression that has moved past professional calm into something considerably more complex. Here is what makes an airplane different from every other place where conflict happens. You cannot leave. There is no door you can walk through, no street you can turn down, no room you can exit. The walls are curved and close. The aisle is exactly 20 inches wide. The sky outside is irrelevant. The only world that exists, for the duration of this flight, is this one. 162 feet of pressurized metal. And everyone inside it is watching. Maria Chan said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." "I will lower my voice," Sandra said at the same volume, "when someone addresses my concern." "Your concern has been addressed," Maria said. "The passenger beside you has committed no violation. He is entitled to his seat." "He is entitled," Sandra said, and the way she said those two words made the flight attendant in the rear galley, a young man named Tyler on only his 4th week of service, look up from the beverage cart he was restocking and say quietly to the passenger nearest him, "What is happening up there?" What was happening was that Sandra Whitmore was making, incrementally and with complete commitment, the worst decision of her life. She was also doing it in front of 83 federal law enforcement personnel. She turned away from Maria and toward Douglas. She tapped him on the shoulder sharply. Douglas looked up from his book. And Sandra, leaning in closer than any stranger has any right to lean toward another person on an aircraft, said directly into his face, "I want you to move. I don't care where. Just move." Douglas looked at her for a long moment. He reached into his tote bag and removed a small notepad and a pen. He wrote something down. He tore the page out and handed it to her. The note read, "I have as much right to this seat as you do. I would appreciate it if you left me alone." Sandra read the note. She read it twice. Then she held it up, the gesture of someone producing evidence, and said to the cabin at large, with the confidence of someone who has never yet been wrong about anything, "Did everyone see that? He's being hostile. This man is being hostile toward me." The woman in 14A, who had been watching this unfold for the past several minutes over the top of her shared laptop, said quietly, without turning her head, to the man beside her, "I think this is going to be a federal matter." The man beside her nodded once and made a very brief adjustment to his posture that someone who knew what to look for might have recognized as someone preparing to potentially stand up. The passenger in 13B, who had not moved since boarding and had been looking at his phone with the stillness of someone either deeply absorbed or waiting for something to require his attention, took a photo, not of Sandra, of the notepad, of Douglas's handwriting, calmly, without drama, the way someone who documents things for a living documents things. Maria was back at the forward galley. She was on the internal phone. She spoke in short, precise sentences. She hung up. She walked back to row 14. "Ma'am," she said, "I've spoken to our senior flight attendant and I'm informing you that if this situation continues, we will request the captain to consider a diversion." "Good," Sandra said. "Good. Divert. Get me off this plane and get him off this plane and we'll sort this out on the ground." "If we divert," Maria said carefully, "it will be to remove the disruptive passenger." That passenger is not him. Sandra blinked. I am a gold member. I understand that. I have been flying United for 11 years. I understand that as well. And you are threatening to remove me? I'm informing you of the captain's options under FAA Regulations 14 CFR Part 91, which govern passenger conduct on commercial aircraft, Maria said, with the specific fluency of someone who knows exactly which regulation she is citing and why. A passenger who is disruptive, uses threatening or abusive language toward other passengers or crew, or interferes with crew members in the performance of their duties can be removed from the aircraft at the next available point of landing. Sandra stared at her. Behind her, across the aisle, in the seat by the window, a man who had appeared to be asleep quietly opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of the aircraft for a moment, and then looked at Sandra and then closed his eyes again. His name was Agent Terrence Okafor, 15 years with the Bureau, and he was deciding whether the threshold had been crossed. He decided it had not. Yet, the pilot's voice came over the PA system. Captain David Holloway had been flying commercial routes for 19 years. He had a voice calibrated for precisely this kind of moment. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're aware of a situation in the main cabin that our flight attendants are addressing. I want to remind all passengers that federal law requires compliance with all crew member instructions. Interfering with or being abusive toward crew members is a federal offense. We appreciate your patience and cooperation. Every person in the cabin heard this. Many of them had heard this kind of announcement before, but 83 of them heard it with an additional layer of professional attention, the way a structural engineer hears a sound in a building that ordinary occupants might not notice. Sandra heard it as an overreaction. She made her second catastrophic mistake approximately 90 seconds later, when she stood up from her seat, stepped into the aisle, and said, in the direction of the forward galley, I want to speak to someone with actual authority. I want to speak to the pilot. You cannot enter the flight deck, ma'am, Maria said. I am not asking to enter the flight deck. I am asking to speak to someone in charge. I am in charge of this cabin, Maria said. You, Sandra said, and what followed was a sentence that Maria would repeat verbatim in her incident report, that Tyler in the rear galley would hear and document, that the passenger in 13B would add to his phone's notes application, and that Agent Terrence Okafor, 15 years with the Bureau, would later describe in a sworn statement as the statement that definitively elevated this from a passenger complaint to a matter requiring law enforcement intervention. We will not reproduce the sentence here in full. What it contained was a threat, specific, directed at Maria by name from her name badge, referencing Maria's employment, and including language that, under 49 U.S. Code Section 46504, constitutes interference with flight crew, which is a federal felony carrying a potential sentence of up to 20 years. The cabin did not react visibly, not because it did not register, but because 83 of the people watching had been trained, extensively, to not react visibly until the moment to act had arrived. That moment arrived 12 seconds later. The man in 13B put his phone face down on his tray table and stood up. He was average height, slim build, unremarkable clothes. He showed Maria something in his hand. A credential, held briefly and then returned to his jacket pocket, and said 4 words to Sandra Whitmore. Federal officer, please sit down. Sandra stared at him. You're not a... The woman from 14A had also stood. She was showing Maria the same kind of credential. Behind them, the man who had appeared to be sleeping in the window seat of 14D, Agent Okafor, was standing in the aisle without any particular urgency, the way someone stands when they are very certain that the situation is entirely under control. Sandra looked at the 3 standing people. She looked at Maria. She looked back at the 3 people. Her mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. What is? She began. Ma'am, said the agent from 13B, in the specific register of someone who has said the next sentence many times and means it every time. You have threatened a flight crew member, which is a federal offense. I am placing you under notice that you are being detained pending a law enforcement response upon landing. I'm going to need you to return to your seat and remain there for the remainder of the flight. Can you do that? The cabin breathed. Several people, the couple in 12C and D, the family of 4 in row 17 and 18, a retired teacher from Portland in 22B who had been clutching her armrest since Sandra first raised her voice, visibly exhaled. Sandra sat down. Douglas Reeve had watched this entire sequence from his window seat with the attentiveness of someone watching an event that is simultaneously very familiar and very strange to observe from the other side. He had not flinched. He had not reacted with visible satisfaction. He had watched with the quiet, patient attention that 32 years in federal law enforcement produces in people who survive those 32 years, as the situation resolved itself. The agent from 13B, whose name was Special Agent Raymond Castillo, 11 years in the Bureau, currently assigned to the Los Angeles Field Office's Aviation Security Division, leaned down and said something to Douglas. He spoke slowly and clearly, in the deliberate way of someone who is aware he's speaking to someone who reads lips. Douglas watched his lips. He nodded. The corner of his mouth moved. Agent Castillo straightened up. He looked at Sandra. "The gentleman you've been harassing," he said, at a volume calibrated to be heard by the surrounding rows without being theatrical, "is Douglas Reeve, retired Special Agent in Charge, FBI Chicago Field Office, Counterintelligence Division. 32 years of service." He paused. "He's also traveling to meet his new grandchild. I'd like you to think about that for a moment." Sandra Whitmore's face did something complicated and prolonged. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a completely different quality of quiet than the one that had preceded Sandra's declarations. This was the quiet of a community of people who have witnessed something together and are now in the shared wordless space of processing it. A woman in 19C began to applaud. She was alone in this for approximately 2 seconds, and then it spread row by row, not a roar, but a steady, deliberate sound, the kind of sustained approval that has conviction behind it rather than performance. Tyler in the rear galley, who had been on only his 4th week but who would later say this flight was the reason he chose to make a career of it, joined in from the aisle near row 22. Douglas Reeve turned back to his window. Outside, the desert had given way to the pale geometry of agricultural land, the organized grid of the American interior unfurling beneath the wing. He picked up his book. He found his page. He was at the part where the climber on the mountain, after a long and dangerous passage through the dark, has arrived at a place where the light is extraordinary. United Airlines Flight 2247 landed at Chicago O'Hare International Airport at 12:47 p.m., 18 minutes ahead of schedule. The aircraft taxied to Gate C-18, and the jetway extended with its characteristic mechanical sigh. Sandra Whitmore did not deplane with the other passengers. 2 Chicago Police Department officers were waiting at the gate, along with an FBI liaison and a TSA supervisor who had been notified during the flight. Sandra was escorted from the aircraft last, past the forward galley where Maria Chun stood with the precise expression of someone who has navigated an entire storm and has nothing left to prove, past the gate desk where Devin the gate agent in Los Angeles had, through the airline's internal alert system, already been notified of the outcome of the flight he'd been quietly relieved to see depart. The charges filed against Sandra Whitmore in the Northern District of Illinois included 1 count of interference with flight crew members and attendants under 49 U.S. Code Section 46504, 1 count of threatening a federal employee under 18 U.S. Code Section 115, and 1 count of harassment of an individual with a disability under applicable federal statute. Her attorney, hired 3 days later, would describe the situation to her in terms that required 2 meetings to fully convey. Because the facts of the case were not in dispute, they were witnessed, documented, and attested to by 83 credentialed federal law enforcement personnel, 12 civilian passengers who provided voluntary statements, and a complete recording from the aircraft's cabin monitoring system. United Airlines placed Sandra Whitmore on their no-fly list within 48 hours. She was joined, in the weeks that followed, on the no-fly lists of American, Delta, and Southwest, the airlines she had spent 3 years filing complaints against, who found, upon reviewing their records in light of the incident, that a pattern of behavior had been there all along, visible in the aggregate in a way it had not been individually. The legal proceedings moved with the particular speed that cases move when the evidence is comprehensive and the witnesses are numerous and professional. Sandra accepted a plea agreement. The terms included a substantial fine, a period of community service, and a public apology that her attorney drafted and she signed, an apology to Maria Chun, to Tyler, to Captain Holloway, and specifically to Douglas Reeve. Douglas Reeve, retired special agent in charge, arrived at his daughter's apartment in Lincoln Park that Tuesday afternoon carrying a canvas tote bag and a gift wrapped in silver paper. His daughter, a woman named Clara, who had her father's patient eyes and her mother's gift for laughter, opened the door and hugged him for a long time. She had seen the social media posts, which had appeared within hours of landing, drawn from the voluntary statements of passengers and the account of Agent Castillo, who had been asked by several colleagues to describe the sequence of events and had done so with the careful accuracy of someone making a formal report. "Dad?" Clara said, holding her daughter against her shoulder. "You didn't even put the book down, did you?" Douglas looked at her. He smiled. He signed something with one hand, a short, fluid gesture, and Clara laughed. "He says he was at a very good part," she told her husband, who was standing in the doorway. The baby made a sound. Douglas Reeve looked at her for a long time. In his 32 years of work, he had seen the full range of what human beings are capable of. He had stood in rooms where the worst of it was documented in detail and spent years doing the careful, methodical work of accountability. He had learned, over time, that dignity is not something that can be taken from a person. Can be attempted. Sandra Whitmore had attempted it at 36,000 feet, in front of 83 federal officers, and failed completely. What Douglas had maintained throughout the entire sequence, the card, the notepad, the patience, the book, was exactly what it had always been. His United Airlines, in the weeks following the incident, announced a revision to their crew training protocols for incidents involving passengers with disabilities, specifically addressing how crew are empowered to intervene earlier in patterns of behavior that meet the threshold of harassment. The revision was, in part, the result of a detailed letter submitted by Maria Chen, who wrote it on her own time and submitted it through the standard employee feedback channel, and which made its way, through several internal escalations, to the desk of a senior policy director who had herself been delayed on a flight once, years ago, by a situation that had resolved less cleanly than this one. The retired teacher from Portland in 22B wrote about the flight in a letter to her daughter. Her daughter shared it, with permission, traveled. Here is what Sandra Whitmore learned at 36,000 feet, at the cost of her flying privileges and a portion of her savings, and a very long and unpleasant afternoon in the custody of the Chicago Police Department. That silence is not weakness. That a laminated card is not a disadvantage. That the people around you in an airplane cabin are not an audience for your performance. That 83 of the 289 people on a given flight might be watching with the trained patience of people who wait until the moment is exactly right and then act precisely without excess or theater. And here is what every person reading this story already knew or suspects, or is being reminded of. That the most dangerous thing you can do to a person is underestimate what they carry quietly. If the story found you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The cabin is always fuller than it looks. And the person sitting beside you in silence might have more authority in their smallest gesture than you will ever have in your loudest moment. We'll see you on the next flight.